Hey, this is Brian Hood from 456recordings.com, and today I'm going to show you how I edit drums. And I know this is a subject that's been covered extensively in the past by many engineers and a lot of blogs and written tutorials, video tutorials, you name it. But for those of you who want to know how I do it, there's probably a few things I do differently, and if you know me well, you know I'm all about efficiency and cutting out as many steps as possible to get the final result. So what I have here is a song that has been tracked and comped down into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 takes. And the raw drums, you have a kick mic, snare top and bottom actually, tom 1 mic, tom 2 mic, tom 1 and 2 triggers, which I'll show you what I do with. You have hi-hat 1, hi-hat 2, left and right hi-hat, ride, china 1 and 2, which I believe is the left and right china, and then overhead tracks. So what I have here is an outline going over each of the steps that I take for drum editing, and I'm going to go through each of these with you on this video. The first step is to check the punch-ins, and I do what I call the blind test. This is where you hit play without looking and see if you can tell where the punch-in is. Those are good. That one's fine. That one has a little weak hit. We can pull that back. That's fine now. That one's good. That one's weird. Definitely something weird going on there. And you can see on this take, you have hi-hat 2 hit. On the previous take, you have hi-hat 1 hit. So make sure you just pick one of the two. I would probably take hi-hat 1 over the hi-hat 2 one. And I might actually slide it back even further. And if you need to, you zoom in very closely and make sure you have this right on the transient, and you don't want any sort of weird hits that come in early, which that's not the case right here. So that passes the blind test now. And I believe that's all the punch-ins. Let's see. Yeah, that's it. So step 1 is complete. Step 2 is making cuts to the shells, and there's 2 ways you can do this. With most drummers in metal, if they have busy feet or if it's kind of a sloppy drummer, I will typically edit the kick drum separately from the rest of the shells. And that is so you can edit the drums without the feet getting in the way, because of how many kick drum hits there can be in sections and throughout the song. It would just absolutely destroy the cymbal tracks if you make cuts on every single kick drum hit to the cymbal tracks. And that's not to say I won't make cuts at the kicks in the cymbal tracks, but it's a lot fewer and far between. And I'll definitely go over this in the video with you a little bit later on. So now we're going to make some cuts on the shells. So select snare mic and tom 1 and 2 mics. And since I have triggers here, I'm going to actually use those instead. If you don't have triggers, mics are completely fine, but triggers generally have a better transient and less bleed, which makes it easier to cut correctly. And keep in mind, we're going to do kicks separately for this track. Pull up Beat Detective. Put it on enhanced resolution. And I generally have the sensitivity somewhere between 40 and 50%. Make sure you hit capture selection. You're going to get a little notice there. But 40 to 50%. And I'll start at around 40, and we'll move it up from there if we need to. But hit Analyze. And this should map out where all the cuts will be. Keep Beat Detective open and just zoom in and select the rest of the drums. This will be everything except kick drum, because like I said, we're going to do kick separately. And start checking through these markers and make sure nothing is cut that shouldn't be cut. And everything that should be cut is cut. So for example, these hits are not being picked up. Let's bring the sensitivity up until those hits are being cut. 56. One thing, you want to err on the side of caution because you can always go back and make extra cuts. And honestly, you can go back and delete these extra cuts as well. It's a little harder to take the cuts away. So I'm going to keep it at 43% because I see right here is this horrible double hit. And these are a pain when you start editing drums. And if you go even higher here, there's a nice double hit on a single snare hit there. You don't want that. So keep it around 46, I think. And we'll go back and make these cuts separately. And the whole thing about this process is you do it quickly. I'm doing it a lot slower than I would just for the purpose of this video, but you're making the bulk of your cuts in a very quick amount of time, less than 3 minutes. So I'm just going to go ahead and commit here and make these cuts. So you just hit separate. And that's the majority of your cuts in one little section. Now you want to go through and make cymbal cuts. So step 2 is done. And this part isn't necessary most of the time if you're doing kicks with the rest of the drums, because in general, the kick hits are going to be at every single cymbal hit. And there may be big sections where you need to go through and manually cut the cymbals up, like right here, except if you were doing kick drums with it, see there's a kick drum right on the cymbal hit. A little cleaner drummer, we could have probably done kick drums with it. So we're going to go through and manually cut cymbals here. And what I'm doing here is there's these little double hits from early kicks. These are just bad cuts by Beat Detective. So there's a cymbal hit. I'll put it on slip mode. Just make this quick process. I do this all by sight. And these right here are your kick hits that you're actually going to edit in the overheads. And I call these naked kicks. And these are the kick drums that are by themselves. There's nothing else going on around it. And let me solo this for you. These are the ones that when you actually edit everything together, they have to be on the grid or else it'll be sloppy sounding. So this is what you're going to cut along with the cymbals. But this process is a little bit faster than trying to fix. And there's probably going to be people that argue whether you should edit kick drums with the rest of the drums, but I am very adamant about the fact that if the drummer's sloppy or there's a lot of kick drums, it's infinitely better to edit kicks separately and just cut these manually in the overheads. Now what is this? There we go. Things to look out for: cymbal hits that haven't been cut, these little mini cuts, double cuts that shouldn't be there. Those are usually around punch-ins, like there might be a punch-in right there. There is. So the Beat Detective cuts it right on the transient, plus there's a punch-in right here. So you just have to watch out for those. And here's 2 snare hits that didn't get cut. I also do this. I'll move the snare mic down here. And I make all the overhead tracks small. Ugh. Let's just do this. Medium. Medium. I pretty much just need small. Let's do the toms too. I pretty much just need the tom triggers to guide my cuts, the snare mic to guide my cuts, and the overhead track to guide my cuts. Everything else is pretty pointless. So you're going through and cutting the naked kicks, as I call them, and the snare hits that didn't get cut with Beat Detective. And this is probably the second most time consuming process. It'll take you anywhere from 15, 20 minutes up to an hour, depending on how busy the song is. And here is a section you want to look out for. This is an early kick, and you're going to have what's called a kick snare flam. And the only way to do this is ignore it for now, and when we quantize, we'll have to probably stretch something. I'll go over that later. Going through, getting, if there's, these are other things you have to just know what they are. This is another kick snare flam, or just a kick, early kick into a cymbal. And it's the same deal. Once we quantize, we'll try to fix that. And I'm ignoring some of these kicks. Probably get, see these early kicks you can't do anything about right now, but you should probably get these other ones. Yeah, he was pretty off on all these kicks and the overheads. Rushing, rushing, rushing. And this should be a flam. Yeah, don't cut the flams. I mean, cut the first hit, don't cut the second hit. You're not going to quantize a flam. And as you do this more, you're going to get faster and faster. I probably haven't edited a song on drums in about a year because I have assistants to do this for me now. But in my prime, I used to be good at this. So the cuts have been made to the naked kicks and the cymbals using a combination of tab to transient and manual cutting. And next we have snap to grid. Now there's several ways to do this. You can do beat detective, which is stupid, and I'm not going to do it. There it is. I don't know what I'm doing. Conform. No. Anyways, just don't do that. It's stupid. But what I do is a shortcut that is Control-0. And what that does is it snaps the regions to the grid based on what your grid resolution is set to. And you can do grid resolution up here to whatever you want it to be, or you can do it via keyboard shortcut, which on Windows, which is what I'm on, is Alt, Windows key, and then numpad plus or minus. If you're on Mac, I don't know what you do. Look it up. So we're going to go through and usually keep it around 16th note grid, I think, or 8th note grid on this tempo, and select a rather large region. And you get good at kind of spotting each hit and noticing if something is going to be snapped to the wrong grid. So I could snap all these to the grid at the same time. Those are good. And sometimes I'll alternate between undo and redo to make sure nothing was snapped incorrectly. And I just go through, and until I get to something that is faster than the grid I have, I just keep doing big sections and checking. And here's a section that has a pretty fast grid. So I'll bring this up to 16ths, and you see how it's rushed. So what I'll do is I'll slide this back and quantize. And I'll do this for other sections. So all that looks good. And if you need to listen through it, you can. So here it, yeah, these are all good actually. And you basically just do this throughout the song, watching out for certain things, like see how this was snapped to the wrong grid. Gonna make sure that doesn't happen. And to do that, you're gonna have to move little sections around manually. And this little punk beat can get kind of tricky because the kicks can be thrown everywhere. Like that is horrible, whatever that is. Gross. Ugh. Okay, you remember this section earlier? This is where the kick snare flam happens. And if you notice at the kick snare flam, you see how there's your kick, which ignore the kick track, it's off right now. But in the overhead, you can see that that's the kick hit, and that's the snare hit. And right now it sounds like garbage. And what you want to do instead is, once you quantize it, it actually gets rid of a lot of that early hit. And I'll go over a stretching method we can use after we do the fades, but keep that in mind. I'm going to put a marker here, kick, snare, flam, and go over that when we do the fades. So adjusting your grid as you go is important, and checking for incorrect grid snaps throughout the song, and you'll get this done pretty quick. I can probably get this done in real time in under 15 minutes maybe. And I'll probably just speed it up like I did the other section. With more Benny Hill, yay! At this point, everything's been cut and snapped to grid. And now we have to render the fades. And this is again where I use Beat Detective because it just does everything very well. It not only does fades, but it takes these small gaps you have between the hits. Let me find a good one here. And it will automatically slide it back and fade it just like that. And I'm not going to do that for every single one manually, but that's essentially what it does. And there will be some mess ups here and there that we'll fix, and I'll go over that in the video. But so you'll go to Edit Smoothing. I usually have the crossfade length about 10 milliseconds up to 15. Let's put it on 12. Fill in gaps and crossfade. Capture selection. And then hit smooth and wait. So the fades are done. And now we have to check for mistakes. This is a very important part because this is quality control for pretty much everything you've done so far. A lot of the edits I've done to this point were just by sight. I wasn't really listening to what I do. So this is where you catch any mistakes you made when quantizing, any fade mistakes, and all sorts of things. And this will be the second most time-consuming part, if not the most time-consuming part. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to go through and look for a mistake that I see and kind of touch on the issues I find. Here's one. This is a flam with a kick drum, an early kick drum. This is one of the issues I was talking about earlier that I'll have to stretch out. What you do in general, this is a little trick I found when I first started editing drums, and it's awesome. And you have to have Wave Sound Shifter to do it. There's other algorithms for stretching, but this one works the best by far for drums. So the trick is when you have an early kick drum like this, you can't slide it right because it comes in even earlier. If you slide it left, you still have the early kick. What I do is I'll cut on the transient, delete. Ooh, there we go. And I'll slide this back into that, delete, and this is the gap you have. And you have two options. You can either go and copy paste it apart, which I could probably do. Like for this. Yeah, I could probably just throw that in there, but I'm not going to do that. Yeah, you can get away with that, and that's probably the better option. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to show you. You want to cut either right on or right after the transient, depending on the part, and go to your preferences, processing, and for TCE and TCE plugin, instead of DigiDesign, do Wave Sound Shifter. And that's it. And now when you go to TCE and stretch this out, it uses Wave Sound Shifter, and it might pop up here. No, it didn't pop up here. But now you have a stretch note, which you'll fade, and it's very transparent. I'll just solo the cymbals for you to hear. And honestly, for this particular hit, the copy and paste method is going to be better, but just for the purpose of this video, I wanted to show you that little trick. Ooh, here's that little kick snare flam. Okay, first thing I notice is, let's get rid of that. First thing I noticed is there's a snare hit that I did not stretch or did not quantize. So I'm going to cut that and move it and go ahead and fade this now. And that actually fixes our early kick problem because it's no longer there. It's exactly what we wanted to happen. There's a little gap here, but I can probably pull this back and fade it, and it won't be... Ooh, that little problem here. Yeah, I didn't cut this very well. It's hard to make a video and have a good quality edit at the same time. This is going to have to be stretched, actually. Maybe not, actually. If you wanted to stretch this, you could do the same thing I just showed you, where you just take this, stretch it, fade it, and see how it sounds. Here is a great example of a kick snare flam. And when I say great, I mean a horrible example. You don't want these at all. And most people don't even notice this kind of stuff, but anytime a drummer hits a kick and a snare at the same time, he almost always, this is true for most drummers, they almost always hit the kick drum first, which in the overheads and drum mics, it's not desirable. Yeah. So what you have to do to fix these is first make sure the cut is on the snare transient and not anywhere on the kick transient. Line it up to the grid. And then here you have, it's rushed first of all, but there's the beginning of the kick transient. And this is like what we fixed earlier, where you're going to end up stretching this gap right here, because you can't slide this back or else it exposes that early kick, and you can't slide this forward because he rushed it. So you literally have a gap there, and the only thing you can do is either A, copy and paste from another section, which you could do. It's hard to do because he hits both crashes there. Yeah, and he's kind of moving around. So what I usually would do, especially for something this small of a stretch, I'm going to cut right after the transient, use TCE with Wave Sound Shifter as my algorithm, and just stretch it out. Then I can fade it right on the hit to where if you do too big of a fade, it's going to expose that early kick drum, which is what you don't want. So have it faded right on there. And this you just fade right there. You can't even tell it's stretched. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll slide this forward so this actual stretched area that you hear is a much smaller area. Voila, fixed. So the final step is to consolidate this. And well, this is done. Let me mark that out. The final step is consolidation. But before you do that, you want to save a backup in case you need to recall this. Because once you consolidate this, you either have to load a backup save, which is undesirable, or you can just save another folder. And what I will do is make a folder. I just call it 456 because that's my studio name. But you can just say, like, drum edits, and just say song 1, drums, pre-consolidation. And that way you have these drums saved in this state at any time. You can pull it back up in case you miss an edit. I do this all the time, especially with engineers doing my editing for me. I want to have the ability to pull this back up and re-edit something, because once you consolidate, it's really hard to fix things. And then I'll make a new save that's like, drum to MIDI, which is the next big step. Highlight. Make sure you don't have kick selected because, like I've said a million times, we're going to edit the kick separately. And then Alt Shift 3 is consolidation. And that's pretty much done. Next, you want to, let's see, we did that. Consolidate, done. Next is drums drum to MIDI conversion, which I'm going to cover in a second. But first, I'm going to edit these kick drums. And to save time, I'm not going to do it on camera. But you get the general idea. You're going to make cuts with region separation. And for kicks, I usually put on a high emphasis preference. And I usually have it around 25 to 28%, depending on the gain of the kick drum. And you'll go through just like you did everything else. And make sure your cuts are good. Just eyeballing it, I don't see any weird cuts. Every cut, or every single kick's being cut. And things like snare hits are not being cut, which you don't want it to cut on snare hits. This complicates things when you're quantizing. That should be pretty much it, yeah. Separate. And then from there, it's just a matter of going through and editing kick hits with the quantize key, changing your grid resolution around. So now everything's edited, consolidated, and it sounds pretty clean. And now it's time to convert the drums to MIDI if you're doing resampling, which for this style of music is pretty popular to do, right? We're going to take a program called Massey DRT, and I believe it's around $100. I'm not sure. Whatever they charge for it, it's worth it. But it's this awesome thing that takes drums and converts them to MIDI. Simple as that. So, and the reason you do this is it makes it so much easier to resample drums and to edit the velocities of the samples. So for kick, analyze. You'll just adjust these two sliders around until you're not getting false triggers, which is pretty straightforward. As you can see, it's pretty much spot on now with like 2 seconds of work. From there, you just adjust the velocity to what you want it to be. If you want it to be very natural, have a high differential. That's basically the compression on the MIDI, is this knob. You can have a low compression, which is a lot of dynamics, or you can just put it pretty flat and have zero dynamics. I tend to keep it, for kicks, about right there. Keep it up high. And then you can just select your MIDI note, which I do E3. For whatever reason, drag and drop it in, and you have kick drum MIDI. Easy. Do the same for snare. This is a little more tricky, but yeah, you're going to have little parts like this that you have to add in manually, but let's get the majority of it fixed first. So for example, this is not picking up well, these little ghost notes here. Start sliding things back until it's all there. But what you don't want is these little double hits, because having to go through and fix a ton of those is super annoying. So try to find a happy medium, and then you can just do the rest manually. And Massey does a pretty good job of making these phase accurate. You will, if you are blending samples to mics, you will have to print these out and just double check the phase accuracy of each hit. But generally, it's a pretty easy step. So right here, everything's good except for this little ghost note part. So what I can do is either I can add the MIDI notes in after, or I can just look at the transients here and add the MIDI notes in. Right on the transient myself. Yeah, that's it. Snare's done. And this is where the tom triggers come in handy, because it's so much easier to pick up MIDI data on trigger tracks than it is mic tracks, because like I said just earlier, the same thing with cutting. It has a sharper transient and less mic bleed. So I can just bring this way back. Oop, not too much. And honestly, D-drum triggers work way better for a sharp transient, more accurate. But the trade-off is that they are very poorly made and they break easily. So I tend to just stick with Roland. They don't work as well, but they're fine. And one thing I didn't do on snare, which I would suggest doing, is readjusting the velocity to be more natural. You always want the toms and the snare to be a lot more natural than the kick drum. The kick I keep pretty much at like a 127 to 120 velocity, and then the snare and especially, or the toms and especially the snare, are going to vary depending on the part. Like a roll here, that looks like a pretty good, whoops. There's no undo button in here, but that looks a pretty good velocity there. So those are done. And I would definitely redo these toms if I were using this data. But this is just for the video. I'm not going to use this for anything. If you are familiar with this band, you know this album's been out for a long time. See that? Should not be there. It's just 2 hits. 2 hits, 1 hit, 1 hit, 6 hits, 3, and that's done. And just like that, in a matter of about, oops. Oh, I did it wrong. Oh well. I can't care for a video too much. There we go, I fixed it. And like that, you have MIDI data for the entire song. So you can add whatever samples you want in, and then to adjust the MIDI velocity on something like this, where it's little ghost notes, you would just swipe around. And you can make things sound super natural. Not super natural, but very natural. There we go. And that is the final step. From there, it's just a matter of making your drums sound good. But if you practice this a lot, you should be pretty quick at it. I could probably get this 2-minute section done without interruption for video in about 30 minutes, 45 minutes tops. And that's 2 MIDI conversion. And from there, it's just a matter of getting your velocities set and then blending the mics in with the samples. And that pretty much wraps this tutorial up. If you want more info about me or my studio, go to blog.456recordings.com, and there are a bunch of articles that can help you out with your studio. I'll probably have some more tutorials on there. If you sign up for the mailing list, I'll send you a free mastering tutorial, and that won't be on YouTube. That's just a subscriber-only thing. And as you can see, if you're noticing, if you're very perceptive, they can see that this is placeholder text, because this is my redesign mock-up. It's not an actual... This is not what my blog looks like at this point, but hopefully by the time this video goes up, this design will be done with all the correct text in there. But anyways, if you have questions, feel free to leave it in a comment or email me at brian@456recordings.com, and I will try to get back to you.
You skip the dick and go straight to the bullet.